Cherionna, welcome tonight, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. I think it's a brilliant program. It's such an interesting idea. So,
right. So we'll start this journey down the personal storyline, and we'll start from the beginning, placing it at the time your conception. And where were you, your parents, at the time around your conception time? And what year was it?
yeah, so I was born in January 1955. I believe I was conceived in April 1954. It feels like a long time ago in this moment. And we were in Sarnia, Ontario, in Canada. And Sarnia has developed a reputation for being a town that's very polluted. There was a time, I was surprised a few years ago, I looked it up on Google, and I discovered that it was rated as having the highest particulate level of anywhere in Canada, which means like the highest air pollution. And I think there were 5 petrochemical plants there, and my father worked at one. So I can say more in a bit, but I think that's part of what led me into the work I do. It's a very toxic environment.
Actually, you started creating the image of the background at the time. So would you like to say a little bit more about the details of that space-time culture background of that 1954 period of time in Canada, in that place?
Yeah, so 1950s in Canada, Sarnia, I think it's a big city now, but it was a small town at that point. And my parents had recently moved there from Toronto, which is a big city. So I'm not sure how many people they knew there, actually. They knew their neighbors. I understand there was a real neighborhood feeling. They lived in, I guess it was a suburb. The Canadian houses tend to be quite small, and it's kind of traditional, I think, Canadian house, little bungalows made of brick. So they lived in one of those, and there were a lot of those. And actually, I remember there was a lake just at the end of our road. So that was a wonderful thing to have the lake there. But, you know, in the mid-50s, it was quite a conservative world. And my father was an engineer who really discovered several years later he was actually an artist in disguise. So like he was an odd person, but it's like he never really fit in. And he was struggling to be as normal as possible. My mother was very good at being normal and accepted, and she was a real people person, she would always say. I think she had an ability to be happy anywhere, which I think is something I've gotten from her, actually. But they were people of the 50s. So the kinds of things we talk about, they would never imagine and would think were completely crazy. Certainly my father would think it was completely crazy. My mother was very interested in child development, which I think was unusual at the time. She actually, I was going to talk about this a bit later, but maybe I'll just say it. You know, she actually became president of what was called the Child Study Society, I think it was. And my understanding is, you know, it was mostly women, you know, housewives would get together and read books or articles or whatever, and invite big names in the field who I imagine were doctors or psychologists or something like that, to talk about child development. So she was very interested in that kind of thing. And I think that was unusual at the time. You know, it was a time when kids were supposed to fit in. Everybody was supposed to fit in, you know, and things were quite formal. You know, people wore relatively formal clothes to do almost everything. You know, very different from today.
Right. And in terms of this crazy aspect, not exactly fitting, what was it? How would you describe it? Your father being an engineer and trying to be, you said, a little bit normal. What was his new aspects that he brought to the community at the time?
Well, it wasn't so much that he brought new aspects. You know, what I learned later was my father was mentally ill. So, you know, he was quite a disturbed person, which had a huge effect on me, of course, and our family.
Okay.
So it was hard for him to be in relationship with people in an acceptable way. But he also was an artist, and he didn't know that yet. It was quite a few years later he found that out. That's a little bit later in the story.
Right. Okay.
But, you know, to say artists see things differently than other people, you know, he was always very creative. And I don't think that was highly esteemed in small town Canada in the 50s. You know, you were supposed to be like everybody else.
Yeah, right. And what were the main values that this time space offered generally to people? Or more specifically to you?
Yeah. Well, you know, I can say that I came into a middle class, you know, white privileged family. These days, you know, we really look at those things. Both of my parents were professionals, which was unusual then. You know, my father was an engineer. My mother was a nurse. And most women at that time didn't work. Certainly once they got married, they stopped working, or certainly once they had children. My mother did stop working when she started to have children. When I was 7, she went back to work. And, you know, I remember I don't think I knew any other kids whose mother was working. It was very unusual at the time.
Right.
I think another important aspect of the culture at that time was it really was a culture of denial. You know, people weren't supposed to have negative, unacceptable feelings, or were they even supposed to have emotions? I don't know. They were supposed to be happy, pleasant people, and you know, kind of plastic, I think of it, you know, not so alive and vibrant. They're supposed to fit into the mold. And so if there was anything different, like my father being mentally ill, nobody talked about that. These days, I think it would be acknowledged, you know, and there'd be support for that. But in those days, you just didn't talk about it. My mother would tell us that my father was sick, so we had to be, you know, understanding.
Yes.
You know, nobody in general talked about those things.
Yes, that's right.
And certainly, you know, they wouldn't ever acknowledge that babies had consciousness, or there might be birth trauma or that kind of thing. Nobody would ever think of that kind of thing.
Yes. How many children were there in the family?
So I had an older brother. He was 3 years older than me. And it was just the 2 of us.
Right. So you are the second child in the family.
Yeah.
Good, good. And
I could say one other thing about that, though.
Tell me.
Which is, I remember having had a twin brother who died in the womb. And I'm quite sure my brother did too, because my mother had a lot of bleeding when she was pregnant with him. So I suspect there were other siblings, you know, like my twin and his twin, who didn't make it. But officially, the official story was
Yeah.
they had a little boy and a little girl, just the way they were supposed to.
So, Cherionna, I guess that you discovered about this, the other sibling, the survival twin, later, much later, right?
Yeah, yeah. You know,
So you will be able to talk a little bit more about that when we continue our story with
yeah,
you,
we can
right?
come to that later. Yeah.
So there were these trades during that time in that space in Canada, and you have already given us some clues about your mom. What is her name?
Ruth.
Ruth.
Yeah.
And your father, whose name is
His name was Marcus or Mark.
Marcus. And you have the brother, now that we speak the names. What is the name of your brother?
His name was Gary.
Oh, good. So what was the relationship between your mom and your dad around the time of your conception? How would you describe that relationship?
Well, I think they were very much in love, and so they'd been married for 7 years by the time they conceived me. They already had my brother. And I think there was probably a lot of tension, stress in the relationship because of my father's mental illness. And my mother had been realizing more and more that it was there. He was acting out. So my sense is it was, there was a lot of love, and there was a lot of newness also. I don't know exactly when they moved to Sarnia, but my parents got married in 1948 when my mother graduated as a nurse, and my father, I think my father had 2 degrees, which also is very unusual in those days. He was quite a brilliant man. So he had a degree in chemistry, and then he went back and got another degree in chemical engineering. And so they wanted to wait until, they finished all the schooling before they started having kids. So then they had my brother, and then my father got what they thought would be a better job as an engineer in Sarnia. So they moved to Sarnia. And I don't think that was too long before I was conceived. So I can imagine, there was a sense of, whole new life and interesting new place to be. And, my father feeling hopeful that maybe this job would work out better for him, and my mother had always wanted to be a mother. She said, I don't know how much she was missing doing nursing work because she loved being a nurse, but I think she felt very good about herself. It helped her self-esteem to be a mother, and she and my brother were very bonded. So I think at the time that I was conceived, that was kind of the background. And they have told me that, I was conceived the first time they tried, they wanted a girl. So
that is important information to know.
Yeah.
Right. And were there any grandparents in the environment, either maternal or paternal grandparents?
Yeah, my mother's parents lived in Winnipeg, where we moved to Winnipeg when I was 5. So they came to visit shortly after I was born, and my mother was very close to them. My father's father had died a few years before, and his mother died just after I was born. So I think she was quite ill at the time I was conceived.
Did they speak about them later on as you were growing up, etc.? Did the environment bring discussions or stories about these grandparents to you or your brother?
Yeah, some. I mean, I knew my mother's parents. I didn't know my father's parents. I heard about my father's father was like my father. He was a very brilliant, creative man. And I think they were probably cool people. They were living in, I think what's now the Ukraine. At the time, they just called it Russia. Everything was called Russia at that point. And so my father's parents met when they were studying at higher education. Not sure what it was called. And they left Russia because they were teaching the peasants to read, and that was illegal. So I think I would have liked to have met those people. You know, they sound to me like they had ideals, and you know, they were doing their best to follow them. However, they arrived in New York, and my grandfather wanted to study medicine, and he started studying at NYU, New York University, where what I've heard is that it was free. They didn't have much money when they arrived as immigrants. And so he was able to afford to go to school there, but he had really bad asthma, and he couldn't tolerate the climate in New York. So then they moved to Canada, they moved to Montreal, and he still had bad asthma. So they ended up in Winnipeg, which is right in the center of Canada, and it's very dry. And he was better, but he became a tailor. Apparently he was a very good tailor, but you know, he was a very brilliant man, and it was depressing to be a tailor. But on the side, he created things. So my father told me that he developed a kind of lock that apparently is what our modern locks are based on. And when he, I can't think of the word. Yeah, patent. He applied for a patent, and somebody else got it just before he did. So he missed it. And he had a few things like that. So he was very creative, and he invented things, but he was quite frustrated. My grandmother, so one of the main things I hear about her was, so my father had 3 older sisters, and my father was told he was an accident. It was pointed out to me by one of my dear teachers in pre- and perinatal psychology that he wasn't an accident. His conception was an accident, which is a big difference, which I appreciate. And so his mother already had 3 young girls that she was taking care of, and they were poor. It was the Depression. He was born in 1923. So he had many stories about being poor in the Depression. And his mother had breast cancer, which I believe while she was pregnant with him, she had a breast removed. So, you know, it's a pretty intense way to come into life. It's understandable why he was mentally ill, you know, with what we understand about early beginnings. And then she was told that she shouldn't breastfeed, but she did anyways. She was also, my father was born at home, and apparently at least one of his older sisters was born in hospital, and she was like this horrible person who did horrible things to people. So my grandmother believed that his older sister was a changeling, that she wasn't really her child, you know, they'd accidentally swapped babies. So she was paranoid about having my father in the hospital. So she had him at home. I don't know if that was a helpful thing or not. You know, he had a very hard beginning. So
actually, so there were some very interesting traits that come to you or up to you, studies and an interest in knowledge that goes from generation to generation and reaches you, creativity,
Yeah.
and an appreciation for children, or at least the development of children, and nursing, which is caring, with the challenges, of course, that illnesses, handicap, or unlucky periods of experiences there may be, but actually there are very interesting characteristics that run in the family. And it's you, because you are also an artist, you are very creative, you are very interested in this very primal period of our existence, babies, you work with babies, so there are a lot of connections already.
Yeah, there's one other also I haven't mentioned from my mother, where she also did later, she did a lot of teaching. And she actually specialized in the other end of life. She worked for years in care homes, nursing homes. And so she specialized in aging. And when she was, after she retired, so when she was when she was like my age, in her late 60s and then into her 70s, she was she called them programs. She was giving programs, teaching people about aging.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that we also see in you, and being involved in education and doing an excellent job.
Oh,
right?
thank you. I feel
So
grateful
people
for that.
say-
For that.
What did you say,
I
Cherionna?
feel grateful to my parents for
Yes.
those positive things they've given me. You know, and the
Oh, yeah.
challenges. Maybe I could just say something about the
Please,
challenges. You know, I think it's a lot of, well, the combination of, you know, my father being such a difficult person and being conceived and gestating and being born, living the first 5 years of my life in an extremely chemically toxic environment, which led to me having allergies and, you know, all my life trying to clean my body out, you know, and deal with that. I think the combination have led to me doing the work I do. You know, I felt a need to look inside myself and do a lot of healing work. So it was hard, but I also feel grateful for that.
This brings me to the next question. What the added value to your existence was added because of all these experiences you have started sharing with us? So you have already spoken about how some of these aspects bring you to where you are now and what you are doing now. Is there anything more that you would like to add to the already said things?
In terms of very early history?
About these early traits of the surroundings and how the grandparents, the parents, the place, the space, the time, and the challenges of the opportunities it carried, how this became added value to who you became, to who you are.
You have such interesting questions. You know, I think what I can add to that or expand on with that is that there was a lot of trauma in previous generations, and is something I'm really fascinated by now. You know, there's a lot more understanding now about epigenetics and intergenerational ancestral trauma. But I think that the way that it got passed down to me and my brother the way it got passed down to my parents, and then to us, that it really did a lot to shape me. And I from a very early age, I was always told I was my father's medicine. So my father might be having a rage and I would toddle into the room or crawl into the room and he would calm down, So, quite early on, I became medicine. And I would say before that, because of various things going on for my mother and in her relationship with my father, that I was what we call a prenatal therapist. I was learning I was taking care of my mother as best I could from inside the womb. And, as I was growing up, I felt like, looking back, I realized that I had to develop a certain kind of sensitivity in relation to my father, especially, and because he was, well, I assume we'll talk a bit about my birth as well. I didn't really bond with my mother because of how my birth happened, but I bonded with my father. So he was the one that I really felt loved and nurtured by. And he also was a very difficult, abusive kind of person. So I had to be sensitive to know when the love was available and when I had to protect myself. And I think that is an incredibly useful skill in life, in relationships, and as a therapist. I think it really led me towards being a therapist. I think from a very young age, I knew that something like this would be my work. I didn't know about pre and perinatal at the time, but I was drawn to therapy. And maybe I can just add to that, this isn't as an early influence, but I mentioned once my mother went back to work, she worked with the elderly. And she would always take my brother and me in to show us off. The elders, of course, love seeing little children. And so I feel like I grew up in nursing homes. I grew up with old people. And my first jobs were working in the nursing homes that my mother worked in. And so it was very natural for me to be kind of taking care of people.
Right.
Curious about people.
So since you brought the conversation to the womb time or your gestation, and you previously spoke about a sibling, a twin, whom you discovered perhaps later on consciously. But how would you speak about your prenatal experience after so much work you have done on this?
Yeah. Well, I feel like my prenatal experience was, for the most part, very challenging. And when I did years of pre and perinatal therapy for myself, when I got to birth, that was like, it wasn't easy, but it was nothing compared to the prenatal time. So, part of that was being in the field of my parents and their difficult relationship, my father's acting out, which was dangerous. And also what I've looked at through my work over the years in pre and perinatal work is that my mother was outspoken about wanting children. But what I came to understand is that she wanted children because she had low self-esteem, and having children helped her feel better about herself. And my feeling as a little one in the womb, I didn't feel wanted. I didn't feel welcomed. And my father was quite outspoken, actually, about not wanting children. He agreed. My mother said she wanted a lot. My father agreed to have two, as a compromise. But, he didn't pretend that he really wanted children. But my mother on the surface wanted children, but marinating inside her, it felt like she didn't. It felt like, to me, like she wanted to be the baby. It wasn't that she wanted a baby. She also had been quite overweight when she was younger. And so she used to tell the story of when she went to nursing school. So my grandmother was a wonderful cook. Then my mother went to nursing school and she lost a lot of weight. I think she lost 50 pounds. I'm not sure how many kilos that is, but it's a lot. And then went home at Christmas and gained it all back again over a couple of weeks, and then went back to school and lost it all again, and did that several times. Right? So she really upset her system and she hated being fat. So, you know, it happens when you're pregnant. You can't help getting fat. So I think there was an element of her really not wanting to be pregnant, which I felt. And also my sense is that she did some damage to her uterus and hormonal damage by having her weight go up and down so much. And so when I implanted in the uterine wall, my memory is of, it was like banging my head against a concrete wall. You know, it didn't feel welcoming or easy. I take a breath with that in case anyone watching resonates with that. I survived and happy to be who I am now. But it wasn't easy back then.
Yeah.
So, you know, my experience is that little ones are very aware of what the real feelings are. And that's what I was feeling from my mother. At the same time, my father was, I think, getting more unstable. And so I lost my twin, I think, because it was such a toxic environment. You know, there was also the chemical toxicity from the air. And I felt like my brother was my ally after I lost my twin. And I remember my brother communicating with me when I was in the womb. But then my father did something very abusive to my brother. And my mother used to say, my brother completely shut down at that point. So he was about 2.5 years old and had been very outgoing and friendly before that. And he shut down. And I remember him talking to me and saying, don't bother coming. There isn't enough love here, even for me. I'm very sad when I think about it even now. You know, like I felt like I lost him as an ally then too.
Thank you for sharing all of that, Cherionna.
Thank you.
Thank
I'm glad
you.
to be out of the womb. And,
you know, people like you who dare and share also are very important messages that we can do better.
Yes.
And that is very important for all of us to realize that we are much more than we can ever imagine.
Yes.
And
I can
as
say that,
please.
That, that experience in the womb, I think, was probably the biggest thing contributing to me doing the work that I do. I feel like it's my mission to help people be aware of how conscious little ones are and what they need. And also the work, Ray Castellino's work that I do, small womb surround process workshops, it creates a different kind of a womb experience, than most of us had, which is really loving and protected and supportive and sensitive and all that, safe. And, I know what it's like to not have that. So it's extremely important to me to support that for people of any age.
Right. So you also share that there is a very good justification, a good connection between what we experience and our perhaps life mission, vision.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly for me. I can't speak
And,
for everyone. But I
and as
think
we move to your birth, what would you like to share about your birth and how it is connected with who you have become?
yeah. So, yeah, my birth wasn't wonderful, but it wasn't, to me, it wasn't as bad as being in the womb. But so the unfortunate thing about my birth was anesthesia.
Mm.
And when my brother was born, he was born in Toronto. My mother was working as a nurse for, I think, an obstetrician. She like working in his office. So she was very aware of birth. And she had that obstetrician take care of her when she was giving birth to my brother. And very unusual, he was born in 52. Anesthesia was normal in those days, but she didn't have any kind of drugs, any kind of medication when she gave birth to him. And they bonded beautifully. And, he was, until this thing happened with my father, he was a very friendly, alive little guy. My birth was very different. So they had moved to Sarnia. She didn't have that obstetrician. She had I think a general practitioner as the doctor in the hospital. And what she has told me is that she was kind of enjoying the pains because to her it meant that the baby was coming. And I could say what I know about my mother. She's also very disconnected from her body. She was very dissociative. So she may not have felt much pain, really. Could be useful at times like that. But she told me that towards the end, they gave her a whiff of something, was her language. So she was given gas. My experience is that she disappeared quite early on in the process. I think she thought it was near the end because she was completely unconscious. And of course, it affected me too. So she didn't remember ever if they had actually given me to her when I was born, or just immediately took me away to the nursery, which is what they did in the 50s. They believed that women needed a rest after the hard work of labor. And so they took the babies to a nursery. And at one point I wrote to the hospital. Actually, my mother wrote to the hospital for me because I couldn't, they wouldn't give me the records, but they gave her the birth records, which weren't very useful. They didn't say very much. It said, healthy baby girl. And the thing that hit me that it said was that they gave me sugar water. So that was the practice in those days. Instead of having the baby be with mom, they took the baby away and they gave sugar water in the beginning. For years, I was hypoglycemic, and I imagine it's because they gave me sugar water. So, but I didn't have my mother. And the practice was to take the babies to the mothers every few hours, on a regular schedule. So my mother and I really, I feel like we didn't bond until I was 50 years old, which was actually a very moving story, but that's later on.
Yeah. So as we now move to your postnatal period, are there any words that you would choose to describe your childhood? What was it like to be the child you experienced in your life? What was it like?
Oh, so through the whole childhood, the whole of
Yeah.
childhood. Well, as you said, like my father, I was very creative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a resource for me. It helped me. I really like to get away from everybody and, read a book, or in those days, we didn't have Google and everything. We had encyclopedias. So in our living room, we had a corner with the World Book Encyclopedia. And I loved to take out there were different letters. I think there were 26 albums or something like that, each letter of the alphabet. So I would just pick one out at random, and I'd look up a country and I'd read all about that country. And then I would take my Barbie dolls and I would have them be in that country, so we'd act it out. My mother liked to sew. And so she made clothes for my Barbie dolls. I had a lot of Barbie dolls. I had the whole family of Barbie dolls. I had a lot of dolls as a child. I also loved, I don't have a lot of memories from before we moved to Winnipeg. So when I was 5, we moved to Winnipeg. And we stayed with my grandmother for a while. But then we were waiting for our house to be finished being built. And then we were on the last street in town, which I loved, because there was a Winnipeg, first I should explain, is on what's called the prairies in Canada. It's very flat, a lot of grassland. And I loved going out to the field that was basically across the street from us and go spend hours there. Wow, nobody in the whole world knows that I'm here, right? So, there was nature to be with. There was also my father. So I think I was 8 when my father got pneumonia, and he had to stay at home. And he was, after a few days of being very ill, he was then bored. So the story goes that he picked up one of my little wooden blocks, and my brother had which one's called? It's like a burning tool for carving. And my father carved a doll for me. And he discovered that he was artistic, and he started making sculptures. And so he had a studio in our basement, and I used to love going down to the basement and watching him do his sculptures. He used a mallet and chisel on the wood. He worked in wood, and I would watch him for hours. I loved that, and seeing this thing emerge from the form emerge from a block of wood, So these are very positive things.
Right.
And there was also, my mother went back to work when I was 7, and we would, my father, not sure exactly when, was a little bit later, I guess. My father quit his job and focused on his artwork for a few years. So he was kind of a stay-at-home dad for a few years. But he, at the end of the day, he would take my brother and me to go pick up my mother from work. So we would go into the nursing home and see all these old people. So they're kind of unusual things for a child in the 60s. And, I think they really did contribute to who I am in terms of, being artistic and creative, and also being interested in people.
Right.
And nature. I love nature.
And then when you went to school, when did you discover that you wanted to study exactly what you studied, which was what? And share a little bit about your school time.
So we moved to New York when I was 15. We lived outside New York City, about 20 miles away from New York City. And my mother was working in a nursing home. And so in the summer, when I wasn't at school, I also went and worked in the nursing home. And I was working in the activity department, which was run by an occupational therapist. I know everybody knows that word in English. Occupational therapist is a little bit like a
Occupational
physiotherapist.
yeah. Ergotherapist or occupational.
Ergotherapist, yeah, I think that's, yeah. And I just love this woman. Marilyn Garfinkel was her name. I thought, I want to be like her when I grow up.
Oh, really?
So I became an occupational therapist, to make a long story short. And I worked at that. I graduated in 1978. And maybe I should just say here also that I had always loved dance, but I wasn't really supported. My father especially didn't support me in dancing. But when I got to university, I went to Toronto to go to university, there was well, let me go back again. I had had a teacher when I was 10, 11 years old, grade 5, in Canada, who was a folk dancer. He loved international folk dancing. And so I learned about folk dancing from him. And I had a crush on him, but I also loved the dancing. So I had to wait until I got to university. And then I discovered there was an international folk dance club. So I got very deeply into folk dancing while I was in university, and the first few years I was working as an occupational therapist. And I was dancing 5 nights a week, when I could. And I quickly started teaching and performing, and I absolutely loved it. Dances from all over the world. And yeah, Olga, I remember some Greek dances and Turkish dances, Nessa, but many others as well. So, however, 1 or 2 years after I graduated and I was working as an occupational therapist in a hospital, I had a concussion doing folk dancing. Now, you would think folk dancing is quite safe, but I was at a workshop that was out in the country, and it was the building had a concrete floor, and we were doing Swedish, Scandinavian turning dances. So where you're with a partner, you're holding onto your partner and turning. And there were basically too many of us in the room, and somebody tripped my partner and me. So I'm slowing down here. If I'd been on my own, I think I would have stretched my arm out, maybe broken my arm. But I had my partner holding on to me. And with all the momentum of the turning, I fell on the back of my head on this concrete floor. Yeah. Fortunately, I've always had very thick bones. I can thank my ancestors for that. But I wasn't unconscious, but it's a very transformative experience. I was dazed, and I don't know for how long. It was probably a minute or two. There was a woman in the group who was a doctor, and I was working at the time in neurology. I was very aware of what she was doing. I remember her asking me what my name was. I knew what my name was, but I couldn't get my mouth to work. It's like I was paralyzed. And, I tried and tried and tried. And finally, I was able to get my name out. And I started laughing because it was so ridiculous, and everybody started laughing with me because they were relieved. But it was a very profound experience. I think about near-death experiences, and it was a little bit like that. It wasn't, but a near-death experience. But, it was very expansive, the feeling of it. And what I remember is that they wanted to continue dancing, and I needed to lie down. So they took me over to the side of the room where there were some mats on the floor, and they lay me down on this mat so they could go back to dancing. And I was lying there in this very expansive state. And I turned my head, and there was a newborn baby on the mat next to me. And I mean, it was so beautiful. And I think about that now. You know, her parent, I think it was a girl, her parents were dancing, and, you know, they brought her with them. So she was sleeping there. I think about it now because that was a major turning point in my life. And I took a week or two off and went back to work, but I found myself forgetting things, and, you know, I wasn't quite functioning properly. And I was worried about that. A year later, I was still having some problems. So I went to a neurologist, and in those days they did a CAT scan of the brain. And I remember as if it was yesterday, you know, going to back to see the neurologist for the results. And he said that what he saw in the scan wasn't what you would expect from a head injury. He said it was diffuse deterioration, which is more like what you would expect from a deteriorative disease like MS, multiple sclerosis. And I had been working with people with that, and I'd often thought, oh, you know, it's the last thing I'd want to get. It so, you know, it can be very debilitating. There's no cure for it. And, you know, I really felt for those people. So that was a huge turning point in my life. And he wanted me to come back and have a spinal tap, which is how they test. I think they still test for MS that way. And this was in 1979. Oh, I guess it happened in 1979, so it must have been 1980 by then. And I remember leaving his office and just wandering around the neighborhood in a daze. You know, they talk about the feeling of the floor falling out from under your feet. That was the feeling I had when he told me. And I walked around the neighborhood, you know, just in a total daze. I'd never been like that before. And something told me not to go back to him. And I'd never had that kind of experience before. But it was a beginning of really listening to my intuition in a deep way. So I never went back to him. As far as I know, I have MS, but what happened was that it led me to various alternative kinds of healing, which led me into body work. And you probably have questions about that, but it was a huge turning point in my life. It was like I was being born again, like that little baby that was beside me.
So you started already speaking about important inspirators in your life. And you mentioned the dance teacher, or the teacher who inspired dance in you, and then how involved you became in the dancing. You spoke about the occupational therapist that you met in your teen years, maybe, and how this led you to your studies and your first graduation, your first degree. And then this incident that on the one hand created a critical point in your dancing career, let's say, but also a critical awakening in your intuition, and perhaps led to something else, because I don't think that the movement, the career in quotation marks that you have started with dancing finished or was complete with folk dancing. So what is the next?
Well, I continued folk dancing. I was quite, you know, one quality I got from my mother is I can be very, I don't know if I'm stubborn. It's kind of a family trait from her family, being stubborn, like, you know, persevering. I like to call it persevering. So I loved teaching folk dancing. And so even though I could barely stand up because I was dizzy, I was having balance problems, I went back and started teaching. And when you teach folk dancing, there's a big circle of people and you stand in the center and you demonstrate, but I couldn't stand on one foot. So I called up two people to stand on either side of me, and I demonstrated the dance with them standing beside me until I was able to do it. I did recover. So yeah, I continued to dance. So just in terms of the folk dancing, one thing that happened was that I also became attracted to other kinds of movement, which influenced also how I did folk dancing. And so I'll just touch on a few things. I went through a few years after the concussion. I actually, after the concussion, I developed some pretty intense allergies, food allergies mostly. Well, allergies to everything, which I had when I was a child, but I was born with allergies, because of the toxic air. But I was better, and then they came back after the concussion. And a friend of mine told me about macrobiotics. And so to make a long story short, I started a macrobiotic diet and way of life. And part of that was taking care of your body. And so I was introduced to Tai Chi and also to acupressure, I guess you'd call it. I actually took a course in acupressure at that point and took some classes in Tai Chi. And I started doing other kinds of healing work. I was also introduced to rebirthing through that, although I didn't connect with anything about birth or prenatal through it. But, it was the first time I heard about rebirthing. So it started to wake me up to other parts of my body, because usually in the folk dancing that I had been doing, we basically moved from the knees down. There wasn't much happening. We did a little bit with our arms, but there wasn't much happening here. And I started to get interested, I think through the Tai Chi and doing some kinds of body work and things, starting to come into my body a little bit more. I felt like the first 20 something years of my life, I lived from here up, really lived in my head. But as I was starting to come more into my body, I was attracted to other kinds of dance. So I started studying African dance and belly dance, Middle Eastern dance, and discovered, oh, it's good to move other parts of my body. And it influenced also how I taught folk dancing, where the folk dance that I had learned was very choreographed. And as I learned about the origins of these dances we were doing, they would come from villages where everybody knew the dance. They learned it in the womb, and they would improvise on a few steps. So I started teaching it that way, which actually wasn't very popular with the group I knew, but I worked with a live band, and it was really fun. But even that changed. I got more creative with the folk dance, more intuitive with it. But then I started learning other healing methods. And it really took me more into my intuition, more into my body. And I won't go into all the details, but it led me to move to Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. And if you know anything about North America, the west coast is very different from the east. And one of my teachers used to say that because it's about to fall into the ocean anytime, that things are much less stable and much more creative. So when I moved to Vancouver, I felt totally at home there. I had always loved Toronto. I'd been in Toronto for 15 years. But as soon as I went to Vancouver, I felt completely at home there. And I was doing more intuitive counseling work, and I found myself starting to do hands-on healing kind of work as part of that, where I had no idea what I was doing, but both I and the client would find it very powerful and helpful. And it started to get more and more physical. So at some point I thought I should probably find out what I'm doing here. So I took a massage and bodywork course and started doing massage. And I ended up taking a 6-month intensive bodywork course in a little town called Nelson, British Columbia, which is about an 8-hour drive from Vancouver. And I ended up staying in Nelson for a few years because I absolutely loved it. But in that bodywork course, we would do a meditation every morning. And sometimes we'd do a dancing meditation. And I really came back to my love of dance. And it was more improvisational kind of dance. And I loved the body work. We were doing deep tissue massage and some other things. But it was also combined with some counseling techniques. So it was very holistic. And so I developed a practice in that and ended up moving back to Vancouver, where, well, actually, I'm jumping ahead. In Nelson, there was a woman who taught 5 rhythms dance, which is the work of Gabriel Roth. And I used to go to her classes and I loved it. And we became friends, and she invited me to go to Seattle, which is in just over the border in the States, to a Gabriel Roth workshop. And I loved the workshop. And as I was there, I was going, why aren't I teaching this? I should be doing this. It's just because I haven't studied it. I don't do it. And we ended up going back again the next year. And I said that out loud to somebody who I had just met. And she said, oh, well, I have a friend who's studying dance movement therapy. And I went, oh, what's that? It's like something lit up in me. Like I had to find out about this. And she said, yeah, she's at a place called Naropa. And it was just like, something really, there's a big spark in me. And I ended up going to Naropa the next year to study dance movement psychotherapy. And it was as in that program, I was introduced to pre and perinatal psychology when William Emerson, who probably everyone's familiar with as a pioneer in the field, came to teach a workshop. We were also doing some pre and perinatal work as part of the dance movement therapy, because you can't work with the body without encountering pre-verbal and prenatal and birth material. So as soon as I encountered this material, I realized I needed more of it. And I had never planned to go to graduate school. But here I was getting my master's in dance movement therapy. And suddenly it hit me that I needed to do a PhD in pre and perinatal psychology. And there were no PhD programs in pre and perinatal psychology. One of my teachers at Naropa was just finishing her PhD at a very alternative but accredited school called the Union Institute. And I looked into that, and I was able to do a PhD there by creating my own program. And there was, William Emerson actually had introduced me to Jean Rhodes, who has been very involved in APA, who, as far as I know, was the first person in the world to get a PhD in pre and perinatal psychology. She did it at the Union. And so she kind of became a mentor for me. She was on my committee, and she helped me create my own program. And just as I was finishing it, Marty Glenn, who I know you've interviewed here, was starting the Santa Barbara Graduate Institute. And she and I had met at a William Emerson event. I was studying quite intensively with William Emerson at this point. And so she invited me to come and teach at Santa Barbara Graduate Institute. And I ended up moving to Santa Barbara to teach there more. And I had already met Ray Castellino at this point. So he had come to Boulder, where Naropa is. I was living in Boulder. And I took a workshop with him and was planning to do his training. when I moved to Santa Barbara, I was able to start working at his clinic and then took his training as well. And so I had a total of 10 years, very intensive study with William and then Ray. There's some other things along the side, but each of those led to the other. Should I keep going?
Yeah, it looks like a snowball, right? One person opens the door and then you meet the whole world of these beautiful minds and the hearts. So when did you what did you do next? I mean, what was your next step and how did you come to this specific areas that you are so well known for? Jaap van der Walt, for example, says, if Cherionna teaches that, I am very happy.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
Perhaps this is a little gift to you from him through us.
Lovely, thank you. So yeah, embryology came up through my PhD. I felt like, since I was designing my own program, I felt like it was important to understand how the baby's body develops, because it seems to me that babies in the womb their body is constantly changing and they're learning through their body. And, they're not thinking about things at that stage. It's all through the body. So I wanted to study embryology. And as part of my dance movement therapy training, I had studied centering body-mind psychotherapy with Susan Aposhen. So body-mind centering was actually developed by Bonnie Bainbridge-Cohen. But Susan Aposhen, who was my teacher, Aposhen, she brought it into psychotherapy. So she called it body-mind psychotherapy. And I studied quite intensively with her for a few years. For quite a few years, actually. Did supervision with her for years afterwards. And learned a lot from Susan. She was definitely one of my mentors. So in body-mind centering and body-mind psychotherapy, there's an aspect of looking at developmental movement. So how babies, the stages they go through in, being able to come out through the birth canal and gradually being able to lift their heads and crawl and walk, all those things. So that's one aspect of it. And so I decided I wanted to study embryology from that perspective. I wanted to do it through the body. And I gathered a group of my colleagues from a training that we had all taken with Susan. And I created a study group as part of my PhD. This was my embryology course. And I actually had Bruce Lipton as a mentor for it. I had met Bruce a few times and found out that he used to teach embryology many years ago. So I asked him if he would be my expert in the field, as well as Susan, who is providing the body aspect. And Bruce is amazing. Most people don't know, I think, about the embryology aspect. But something I really appreciated about him was, I think the first time we met to talk about it, he said, well, look, you're a movement person. You want to look at the movement of the embryo. How does the embryo move and how does it move from this stage to that stage? So that was really helpful and has really influenced. That's something I'm still looking at. And so what I did was I created this study group. And we met once a week for, I forget, several weeks. And each week I would pull out all my embryology textbooks, which if you've ever looked at an embryology textbook, they're very difficult to understand. They're written in medicalese. And I'd go through them and I'd draw pictures and I, try to understand it well enough that I could present it to my group. And then together we found ways to explore it through our bodies. And it was amazing. By the end of the study group, all of us said, this has to continue. So they really encouraged me to start teaching it as classes and workshops, which I did. And I also taught that actually at Santa Barbara Graduate Institute. So that was the beginning of my fascination with embryology. As I was moving into working with Ray Castellino, I had already studied craniosacral therapy, but he had a requirement actually for his training to take at least a 5-day introductory seminar in biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And I really loved it. Well, actually, I didn't take an intro because it kept being canceled. But I ended up taking the training. And that was with John and Anna Chitty, who also became big mentors for me. And they introduced me to Jaap van der Wal. They brought him to Boulder, where I was living at the time. And I was blown away by my experience with Jaap. He's a spiritual embryologist. I joke, I call him Jaap, his name is Jaap van der Wal. I call him Jaap Wonderful. I told him that once and he said, no, it's van der Wal. And I said, I know, but I say Jaap Wonderful. He's like, oh, okay. So working with him kind of reinforced for me the idea of looking at the movement of the embryo, because he works with gestures of the embryo.
Yeah.
But also just the whole story of how really the spirit comes in, which is what I look at in my book, Spirit into Form, that came out last year. So that was the embryology piece. Then there's one more important piece here, which is when I was in Santa Barbara, I began to feel like I needed to go and meet Emily Conrad, who is the founder of Continuum, which is a mindful fluid movement form. I had been introduced to her work at Naropa, but I didn't feel drawn to it then, which is interesting. It was like 14 years later, I started to feel like I was going to die if I didn't go and meet Emily. And
she must have been very old at the time, or rather 18 at the time, or no?
But she was, no, she died just before her 80th birthday. She turned 70 the second class that I went to. I remember, because I had actually arranged to have a private session with her after class, but I had to wait because they were having a big birthday party for her. Right. So it was her 70th birthday. So she certainly didn't look like 70, didn't move like someone who was 70. She was so fluid. So I totally fell in love with Emily. And I think by the time I met her, actually, I felt like intuitively, I felt like I was going to teach Continuum, although I didn't. I had been studying it a little bit with somebody in Santa Barbara, but I didn't know that much about it. So I ended up diving in very deeply with her and moved to Santa Monica, where her studio was, so that I could do basically everything she was doing for several years, and got very close to her. And working with her and Continuum also profoundly affected my understanding of the embryo and the way I taught embryology, because I had been teaching it through body-mind centering kinds of things, where we would act things out. But what I found with Continuum is that it immediately takes us into a fluid embryonic kind of state, like what I'm doing with my body right now. You feel like you're floating in the womb, and you have the kinds of perceptual states that you might have in the womb. So I quickly began teaching that through Continuum. And the Continuum and the biodynamics both really shifted for me, I think, my relationship, how I viewed illness and therapy, because both of them had a focus on health or potential. And I think that's a big thing that some other people are doing some similar things perhaps, but I feel like that's a major thing I bring into pre and perinatal psychology and therapy, you know, where people tend to be drawn to it because of their trauma, including me. But I find it's really important to look at how where there's trauma, there's also potential. And I'm informed by the embryo, you know, that starts as this tiny little unicellular organism, as Jaap van der Wal would say. And look, it develops into these very complex bodies, you know, like we've all done that, but do we consciously know how to do that? Probably not. You know, that's incredible potential. And craniosacral work is based, it comes out of osteopathy, where a basic premise is that there is always health available. Health with a capital H is always there. And we learn to orient to that. So, you know, those have been huge influences for me as well.
Should we also say that your husband was a kind of critical influence?
Absolutely.
When did you meet, and how this influenced your development? One step went to the next, and the next, and the next.
Well, we both think we had met before this, because he was actually teaching in John and Anna Chitty's building where I had an office. And we think we ran into each other when he was doing that. But I think it was 2006, I think. I have to do the math. Yeah, I think it was 2006. I decided, you know, I'd heard about Franklin because John and Anna had studied with him, and, you know, he had developed the work we were doing. So everybody wanted to meet Franklin. And so I think it was in 2006, I went to a postgraduate seminar with him. And do I want to say this on a big public interview? Why not? I remember sitting there going, wow, this is a man I could be with. But I never imagined that was what was going to happen. I thought it was like a model for what I wanted. 2 years later, I assisted him in another postgraduate seminar. And we didn't actually connect that much then, but 2 months after that, we were both presenting at a conference. And we were connecting a bit during it, but I was presenting on continuum and biodynamics and how they overlap. And my presentation was one of the last things in the conference. And Franklin felt compelled to come to it. And at the end of it, he basically declared his love for me. And I already knew how I felt about him. So we decided to, you know, get to know each other by Skype. And 2 years later, I moved here. So we got married in 2010.
Right.
I moved here in 2010. So, yeah.
Right. So, Cherionna, as we have, you have taken us with you as you move from your young beginnings to the now young beginnings. What would you say are the most important findings that now you could share, or you feel are important to share with people? Findings, not messages, findings, let's say 3, 4 most important findings.
Well, I have to say, I find, in my work, through the work that I've done on myself and the work that I do teaching and facilitating and with my clients, students, that being able to connect through our bodies is incredibly important for addressing this early material, where, as I said, we learn through our bodies. So I didn't get that completely on my own, but I think I've evolved that somewhat.
Yeah.
And certainly combined it, when I was learning about that in my dance movement psychotherapy training, it was very cathartic work. Modern trauma work hadn't really come into it yet. And combining that with what I have since learned about how important it is to stay in present time, to stay in relationship to what's resourcing and supportive for us, to stay connected and stay connected relationally, to experience safety here and now.
Mm-hmm.
I find those are the things that really enable us to heal. And it's not just about connection. Yeah, it's not just about having insights. Insights are great. But what I have found most healing is to be able to sense things in the body in relationship, in connection with ourselves and in connection with a safe other or safe others.
And what would be the important messages that you would like to share, or a lesson you would like to share with young professionals now starting to build their own services or their own understanding in the field? What is it?
Well, I think the most important thing in working with this early material is to do our own work. And I teach a training, which I call Our Journey Here, for practitioners who want to address this material in whatever it is they do. And that's a very important part of the training, doing your own work so that you can actually be present with what's in the other person, not just projecting your own history onto them. And not just coming from a place of having to do something because of your own history, but being able to actually be present with them. So to me, that's the most important thing.
And to the scholars, the ones who study the field in whatever way, what would like to communicate to them? The academia, the scholars.
Well, it's really the same message. Do your own work.
It's the same message.
Yeah, I mean, the academics are incredibly important. The understandings are incredibly important. And what happens in your body when you learn about them? What happens for you emotionally when you learn about them? What do you feel? And can you be with what helps you to be with those feelings so that you don't have to be run by them? I look at, so this is also one of the things I think that I bring into the field, is that I see our pre and perinatal material as being almost by definition shadow material. What Carl Jung would talk about as shadow, the unconscious, that the more we don't know about it, the more we act it out unconsciously. Because people are starting, like you, to shine the light on pre and perinatal experience. But for the most part, it's still kind of how it was in the 50s, nobody acknowledging it, right? So that means we have all these experiences and we have nowhere to put them. You know, we can't process them. So we keep acting them out as they're seeking healing, right? So, you know, the awareness is really important, and exploring, discovering, developing relationship with how it is inside us is at least equally important.
And to the policy makers, the decision makers, the policy makers, what would be your message to them?
A person's a person, no matter how small, as Dr. Seuss said. Yeah. So to consider that little ones, even, you know, the conceptus has rights and has experiences and needs to be respected and communicated to. And that parents to be need a lot of support so that they can offer their best to their child, and preferably before conceiving, to support them in doing their own work so that they can be as clear as possible and have as much understanding as possible before they even conceive.
So provide for this service in among the population.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And what would be your message to parents, future parents, new parents?
Well, I think one important message, maybe not to future parents, but maybe, is to be gentle with yourselves, be compassionate with yourselves, forgive yourselves, because none of us is perfect, though we probably are perfect in our imperfection. And, you know, being a parent is challenging. And so to be understanding with yourself, not expect yourself to know it all or be able to do it all on your own. They say it takes a village, right? So to be open to getting support, and if possible, to get support in investigating, doing therapy around your own very early experience, so you can be as clear as possible to welcome in your child and to support them. And if it's, you know, if the child's already here or the child's growing up, you know, it's never too late.
Very nice.
It can be harder later, but it's not too late to do your own work. And children can heal when their parents do their work. Parents can heal when children do their work. They're connected. So there's hope. There's health everywhere. There's potential. Yeah. But
you have written 2 books, at least the 2 books I know, and I have been a witness as you developed, created the 2nd book, noticing how dedicated you are either to a paragraph or a drawing that you meant to insert. What is it that made you an author as well? And what was it that brought you to, from experiencing it first for yourself, out of your curiosity or your need, second, teach what you learned, and then write about what you have learned?
Great question.
So what is your message to your readers?
Well, first of all, Olga, thank you for going through that whole journey with me for Spirit into Form. It was quite a journey. I can say that I've always taught and always written. So I discovered I loved writing when I was about 10 years old, and I decided I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. I didn't feel like I had too much to write about. Although I did write a book when I was probably about 15. I laugh now, but you know, I've always loved writing. And I've always tended to teach whatever I learn. So I mentioned I was teaching folk dancing, you know, soon after I learned it. Really, it didn't take me very long. And I just tend to do that. So I think probably the real answer is it's part of my nature to do that. It's my mission to do that. But I feel very grateful that, you know, that I can write and I can teach. And it seems to work, you know, it gets the message across. And I really feel like I have a mission as I've gotten older. You know, the last few years, I've gotten very clear. I have a mission here. And my mission, which my entire life has guided me towards, is to spread the news, you know, to help people be more aware of little one experience, so that we can prevent more trauma and support little ones coming into the world and heal, you know, so the world can be a better place.
So it is out of compassion and an inner call that brings you to the point where whatever nice and good you have collected, you want to share with the other people as well.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. Thank you.
So this brings me to the question, is there anything you would change if you could?
Yeah, well, there's of course many things I'd probably change if I could, but one that comes to mind is that when I was a young occupational therapist, at that time, occupational therapists weren't working a lot with children. They worked with children with physical disabilities, and not a lot more than that. But shortly after I graduated, that started to change. And I knew I didn't want to work with children with physical disabilities. It just felt too painful to me. I had an internship with children with autism, and I've always been fascinated with autism, and that attracted me. But I made a choice to not work with children. There weren't that many opportunities at the time, but they started to develop, and I could have done it. And when I think back, I think that would have been really useful background to have. I think I would have learned a lot having that background, you know, and because it developed, I couldn't have known it was going to develop that way, but it developed into, you know, working with children with sensory issues, which includes autistic children, children with developmental delays, and also working with babies and working in the neonatal intensive care unit. That wasn't happening then. I don't think any of that was happening then, but it developed. And I think I would have loved to have done that. You know, I'd love to have that in my background, because I think it would really inform me. So I'm, you know, in retrospect, I'm sorry I didn't do that, although I'm glad I did all I did. I don't think I could have done it all. So.
Anyway, there are still some beautiful, powerful decades in front, waiting for you. Who knows what you are going to add? Is there anything else you would like to add before we bring this to a conclusion, Cherionna? We could speak for hours, but we are almost speaking for almost 2 hours now, not really 2 hours, but is there anything else you would like to add which we have missed out and we should not have missed out?
Well, there's two things. They're kind of related. One is that I think there's a little bit more I want to say about my relationship with Franklin, in terms of my work, that, you know, I was already teaching craniosacral, biodynamic craniosacral therapy when he and I got together. And I was quite active in the North American Association. But when Franklin and I got together, we had endless discussions about the work. And it really clarified my understanding of the work, because most of the people that were teaching it had studied with him quite a few years before. And he really evolved in his understanding and his way of teaching it. So by the time I got to him, he was much clearer, and he was writing a second set of textbooks, foundation books, which I helped him edit and wrote a few chapters for. And they're called Foundations in Craniosacral Biodynamics. And then I had the great opportunity to teach with him for years, both foundation trainings to teach new practitioners and postgraduate seminars, all over the world, really, which was fun. But it was lovely to teach with my partner, and people liked having mommy and daddy up in the front, teaching things. But also, again, this really helped me to understand much more deeply this work and to develop my own understanding and also my own way of teaching it. So I'm extremely grateful for that. And I feel like it really influenced me. And also, it was his idea for me to write my first book. I actually, so Spirit into Form had been gestating in me for years. And several years ago, I said to him, okay, it's time. I need to birth this baby, right? And so I'm going to start taking Fridays off so that I can have a writing day once a week. And so Franklin, bless him, said, we could really use an introductory book on craniosacral biodynamics. I thought, well, I guess I could get that done pretty quickly. I'll just do that and get it out of the way, and then I can get to my other book. So, a couple of years later, it was done. And I feel very good about that book. But then I was finally free to write my book. So, say I wouldn't have written that book without his inspiration. So I'm grateful for that. Also, I learned a lot also about writing and publishing from doing that book. And
yes.
I think it helped also. It made me better known worldwide, I think, in the field of biodynamics, so that then I can communicate my deep message about pre and perinatal to all those people as well. But related to all that, I feel like I want to say, I never would have imagined that I'd be living here in the UK with Franklin Sills, in our wonderful little house in our wonderful little town. It's like, I never would have imagined that. And I'm sure it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done years of healing of my pre and perinatal work, because relationships just didn't go that well for me before that. And I never lived in one place very long because of my early experience. So I've been here now for 12 years, in this relationship for 14 years, it's going pretty well. But I feel like I want to say, expect the unexpected, listen to your intuition. You never know where it may be leading to you. Our hearts know what's right for us, and we probably can't really imagine exactly where we're going to go or how, or even why or when. So I think that's my
Let's conclude with this beautiful message. Expect the unexpected and live the magic.
That's it. Live the magic. Yes.
Thank you very much, Cherionna.